Good afternoon. As you'll be aware, the Supreme Court last week dismissed challenges by the Maori Council and others to the government's sale of a minority shareholding in Mighty River Power. This follows the High Court reached the same decision late last year. It means that the government remains on track to offer a minority stake in Mighty River Power in the second quarter of this year, subject to market conditions. Obviously, this is an important policy for the government, and I'd like to acknowledge in particular the effort of Bill English in leading the Crown engagement with iwi for helping us to get to this point. Cabinet today made a number of decisions about the timing and details of the Mighty River Power IPO, which I'll run through in a few minutes. As we've promised, New Zealanders will be at the front of the queue for shares. The actual allocation of shares will be made in decisions taken by ministers. Before we reach that point, we will make it as easy as possible for New Zealanders to get access to information, register their interest and apply for shares. But let me quickly recap on the rationale for the share offer program. Firstly, the government expects to free up between $5 and $7 billion, less than 3% of its total assets, to invest in other public assets like modern schools and hospitals without having to borrow in volatile overseas markets. It makes sense to reorganise the government's assets and redeploy capital to priority areas without having to borrow more. Second, under the share offer program, New Zealanders will get an opportunity to invest in big Kiwi companies at a time when they are telling us they want to diversify their growing savings from property, from bank deposits and finance companies. Counting the government's majority shareholding, we're expecting 85 to 90% of these companies will be owned by New Zealanders. I'm confident we can achieve that. As of last December, New Zealanders held about $115 billion in bank deposits, almost 20 times the expected size of the entire share offer program. In addition, Kiwi saver balances are growing strongly. More than 2 million New Zealanders have amassed over $14 billion in their KiwiSaver accounts. And third, it's good for the companies themselves. Greater transparency and oversight from public ownership will further focus companies on ensuring their businesses are run effectively and efficiently. And the companies won't have to depend entirely on cash-strapped government for new capital to grow. Today I'm announcing details of the Mighty River Power offer as confirmed by Cabinet today. Firstly, the Order in Council decision was taken to remove MRP from the SOE Act. Secondly, a pre-registration process for New Zealanders interested in finding out more about the Mighty River Power share offer will open tomorrow and run through to the 22nd of March, which is about 3 weeks. The offer period is expected to open in mid-April and run for about 3 weeks. The share offer document, which I understand will be a substantial document containing all material and information for investors, will be available at that time. Details of a loyalty bonus for New Zealand retail investors will be announced before the offer period starts. When the offer period closes, the institutional book build takes place. Ministers then make share pricing and allocation decisions, and we then expect that Mighty River Power will list on the share market. My expectation is that, subject to market conditions, the process will be completed in mid-May, most likely before the budget. The Mighty River Power share offer has been designed to put New Zealanders at the front of the queue for shares and to achieve widespread New Zealand ownership. As I've said, the government wants to make it as easy as possible for everyday New Zealanders to apply for shares. Finance Minister Bill English and SOE Minister Tony Ryle will formally launch the pre-registration tomorrow, and I'll hand over to them to speak now.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Tomorrow morning, the Minister for SOEs and I will go to Auckland, where we will officially launch the pre-registration campaign at Mighty River Power's head office. We'll issue details then of how New Zealanders can register their interest in the share offer on a no-obligation basis. They'll be able to do this by accessing a website or ringing a call centre, and when they do that and give their details, they will automatically receive an offer document once it's lodged. As the Prime Minister said, that process runs for around 3 weeks, so people won't have to rush into it. Pre-registering is not a commitment to buy shares. Anyone pre-registering won't be asked for a payment at this stage. Also tomorrow we'll see the start of a substantial advertising and communications campaign covering television, print and online media to raise awareness of the Mighty River Power offer and the process for pre-registering and for applying for shares. The communications campaign will include a strong investor education element for potential investors unfamiliar with shares in the share market. I'll just cover some other aspects of the process from here. You have a graphic of the expected timeline from here in your pack today. As we've announced previously, a syndicate responsible for marketing and selling the Mighty River Power offer to retail investors has been appointed. It includes the retail arms of the joint lead managers Goldman Sachs, Macquarie and First NZ Capital. They will be joined on the retail syndicate by share brokers Forsyth Barr and Craig's Investment Partners and nationwide retail bankers ASB and ANZ. These banks will use their extensive branch networks to offer information, but all pre-registration will be done through the call centre and the website. Once the retail offer opens, New Zealanders will be able to download electronic offer documents and apply and pay for shares online. Arrangements are also being made to distribute and process hard copy applications for those who prefer this approach. All these measures are designed to give everyday New Zealanders the best opportunity to gather information on the Mighty River offer and then decide themselves whether to invest. Following the retail offer period, the institutional book build will occur. This is a standard competitive bidding process where institutional investors bid for a volume of shares at a range of different prices. Based on the result of the book build, ministers will then decide on the final offer price. This price applies to all investors. They will also decide on the allocation of shares at that offer price. For example, the allocation between retail and institutional investors and between New Zealand and overseas shareholders. Before I hand over to Tony, I'd just like to address the issue of stock exchange listings for Mighty River Power. Mighty River Power will apply to be listed on the NZX main board. We expect that its primary stock exchange listing will be in New Zealand. We also expect it to have a secondary listing on the Australian Stock Exchange. There is nothing at all unusual about this. 8 of the 10 largest New Zealand listed companies are already dual listed in Australia. There is a balance to be struck here. On the one hand, we have given New Zealanders an absolute commitment that Kiwis will be at the front of the queue for shares. On the other hand, we want to ensure there is enough tension in the share price for investors. A secondary listing in Australia will help achieve that. Another point worth noting is that some Australian institutions, in fact about 60% of them, under their own investment mandates would not be able to invest in Mighty River Power unless it was also listed in Australia. However, let me reiterate, ministers will ultimately decide who receives the shares, and the allocation of the shares will reflect the government's clear objective of widespread New Zealand ownership. Tony will now outline some of the ways we intend to achieve our requirement of widespread New Zealand ownership.
Thanks very much. As you can see from the material that we've provided you, the government is taking a number of important steps to ensure that New Zealanders are at the front of the queue for the shares, as we've undertaken all along. And we are making the retail offer only available to New Zealanders, and in line with the government's objective of having widespread New Zealand ownership, we've narrowed the definition of eligible New Zealanders to people being New Zealand citizen or resident, having an inland revenue number and a New Zealand bank account, and having a New Zealand address. In terms of the other aspects of the Mighty River Power offer structure, the following decisions have been made. The offer to retail investors will only be made in New Zealand, and you'll see tomorrow that the website for pre-registration has been designed to restrict people from outside New Zealand from pre-registering. We will balance this with our obligation to ensure that taxpayers receive a competitive price for the shares, and that will be partially achieved by seeking institutional support from offshore. The minimum application for shares will be $1,000 with $100 increments. And as we've detailed previously, New Zealand retail investors applying for up to $2,000 worth of shares will not be scaled in the event of oversubscription. There will be a loyalty bonus for New Zealand retail investors who retain their shares for a minimum period. These details will be agreed and announced after the pre-registration period so that investors will know what that loyalty bonus is before they apply for shares. We can also announce today that the government has agreed that the Mighty River Power employees will be entitled to a minimum guaranteed allocation of $5,000 worth of shares each. And as the government has already announced, iwi yet to settle their Treaty of Waitangi claims can choose to invest some of their expected settlements in Mighty River Power. I'll hand back now to the Prime Minister.
Okay, Tony, thanks very much. So our announcements today will give potential investors in Mighty River Power information and certainty about the process from here. More details, including exact timing, will be released as we go along. The decisions we've made demonstrate the government's commitment to put New Zealanders at the front of the queue and to achieve widespread New Zealand ownership. Ministers are still considering options for the next IPO and will make further announcements in due course. So on that note, we'll take some questions. What do you have in go from there?
Prime Minister, so when presumably Cabinet or you ministers sit down to decide what that allocation is, are you giving a guarantee to New Zealanders that you're going to make sure that at least 85% is New Zealand held?
Yeah, I'm very confident we'll meet that. That's been
Is
our
that a
commitment.
guarantee?
Well, that's our commitment. That's what we've been measured by. If we were to reach that target, then I think there would be a lot of questions asked. So look, we're very confident we're going to meet that.
Why are there no details as yet on the loyalty bonus? It's been discussed for some time now. Why isn't it locked in and why isn't it being announced ahead of the pre-registration?
I think the simple answer is it depends on the process that you go through as we look at the pre-registration interest, so get an indication of what that looks like and the implications of that.
So you basically want to have an idea of how many Kiwi purchases are in line before you announce the loyalty bonus.
Yep.
So you're working at your fiscals long term, aren't you, what you might be liable for down the track?
Correct.
So with the $2,000 upper limit, if it's oversubscribed, someone who wants to buy, for argument's sake, $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000, they won't be able to get what they want.
Yeah, so the way that works is that if you apply to up to $2,000 worth of shares and you're a New Zealand resident citizen, then you'll get your $2,000 worth. So if you apply for $1,500, you'll get $1,500. If you apply for $2,000, you'll get $2,000. If you apply for $5,000, depending on the interest, you might get $2,000, you might get $3,000. But up to that $2,000 point, there won't be what we call scaling. Otherwise, what you apply for, up to $2,000 you get. The reason for that is we want widespread ownership, and we want as many New Zealanders to be able to participate as as set to want to, and that's an effective way of making sure that process works.
So New Zealanders are at the front of the queue, but only up to that $2,000 limit, aren't they? They're not at the front of the queue with whatever amount they want.
Well, they may be. It depends ultimately on what the final decisions are made. But again, if you look at the historical pattern in these kinds of floats, that is recognising sort of widespread level of affordability versus interest. Otherwise you could get a situation where a very high net worth individual, just because they're a New Zealand resident, decide to buy a very, very large number of shares, and that might be unfair compared to others.
Will there be a limit on the Australian investors?
Well, again, you've got to remember when it comes to the Australian investors or others from overseas, you're talking about the institutional book build, you're not talking about retail. And yes, the government decides through its advisors the allocation of that book build. So we'll go through a logical process. That process will unashamedly favour New Zealanders, and then at some point we'll look to make some allocations where we think appropriate to other investors, both New Zealand institutions and others. But I think it's also worth remembering with those New Zealand institutions, they are buying shares not because they themselves want them, they buy them on behalf of their investors, and their investors are New Zealanders more often than not.
Of that 49%, how much do you think will be split between retail investors and institutional investors?
We'll We have got some idea on that, but I don't think it's appropriate that we share it at this stage. But the government's very strongly committed to making sure that we have widespread New Zealand ownership. So we have a very strong view that a very significant portion of that would be to retail investors as opposed to New Zealand institutions, KiwiSaver super funds.
Can you give us a ballpark, say significant, 10%, 20%?
No, I'm not giving you a ballpark.
What percentage of the $5 to $7 billion were you expecting to raise from this fund? Roughly, if you don't.
We can give you that answer. Someone can.
Look, that will become clearer when when there's a price range published during the offer period. The commercial, well, the valuation of Mighty River Power is currently 3.6 billion, and the process from here will test the value of this company and others which have not had a market valuation yet.
What's happening with Air New Zealand? Has there been any further sell down of the government's share in that?
No, and no decisions have been made. In the context of Supreme Court hearings and so on, the Air New Zealand float would be a very simple process, and we always reserve the right to make those decisions as market conditions become clear.
So is it just not the right time to sell Air New Zealand shares at the moment, or was it all those legal issues?
Well, it's just the highest priority has been to get the program to the start line, which we've got it to the start line today, and now there's a whole series of decisions to be made about the rest of the program.
And all things going well, in circumstances permitting, would you hope to have Genesis and Meridian listed by the end of the year?
Well, we'll be considering that over the next few months. And I think it's something for Kiwis to keep in mind, that if they don't get all the shares they're after in the first float, there will be other floats coming, and we'll tell them when those will be.
You did indicate last week that that would be the plan if circumstances allow.
Yeah, all these decisions are subject to market conditions, and once this process is underway, we'll then consider what the sort of size and order of other floats would be.
But ideally, would you like to have them done by the end of the year?
Well, we'd like to have them done in a way that gives us the right balance of good value for the taxpayer on the one hand, but getting the government's program executed on the other.
What
You said
advice
you
have
want-
you received about floating free energy companies in succession? What impact does that have on the timeframe for the other IPOs?
Well, we haven't received specific advice on that yet. We've been focused on getting the program to the start line, but we'll now go off to get that sort of advice. The pre-registration for Mighty River Power will give us a test of the depth of retail demand, because up to now that hasn't really been tested. We believe it will be reasonably, should be reasonably significant.
You've said you want to avoid borrowing on international markets which are volatile. Are they really that volatile when you can borrow at 3 to 4% government bonds? Surely you should be borrowing on those markets rather than selling assets that are returning more than 10%.
Well, look, we've been over this about the rationale for the program. It boils down to the certainty of reduction in your debt repayments, and also owing less at the margin. We're already a country with reasonably high external liabilities, among the highest in the developed world. We don't want to extend that position on the one hand. On the other hand, these companies have real commercial risk, and what might have been seen as say last year in the case of Solid Energy, as forecasts of profits and dividends probably won't be met. So the Crown's balancing off that commercial risk. I mean, the theory that you should keep these companies because the dividends might be in excess of the cost of debt would lead you down the road of the government solving its fiscal problems by buying every company in New Zealand. Why don't we go and borrow money at 3% and buy everything? Well, I think everyone thinks that would be a bit odd.
Prime Minister, just back to the issue of foreign investors. In the press release it says ministers expect around 85 to 90%. There's a couple of qualifiers there. Is this a guarantee or not?
Well, we've gone out there and campaigned on being 85 to 90%. Like anything, we're going through a market process now, and we need to go through that and obviously see what interest there is from New Zealanders, and we can certainly make that opportunity, that they are aware of that opportunity. That's what the pre-registration process is about. We can see what interest there is from New Zealand institutions. So in the end, I can't guarantee you a number today, but what I can tell you is I think it's extremely unlikely it would be under 85%. We would feel uncomfortable if it was, and we'll be working hard to make sure it's in excess of that.
How much are you prepared to spend on this loyalty bonus?
Well, again, I mean, all those things will be weighed up. Let's wait and see. But I think it is an important part of your overall offering to have a loyalty bonus, because I think they add to the things that an investor will need to weigh out in terms of making the decision about the purchase of shares. And so it's just, again, part of the favouring of New Zealand investors and New Zealand retail investors.
What stage in the treaty process does NEW have to be able to get this advance?
They have to have a signed AIP, isn't it? That is, yeah.
Yeah, look, it's, the broad definition is that they're not settled, and it's actually been quite a useful process because a lot of them does require them to meet some thresholds, which in other circumstances might take them several years, but because of the goodwill around this, they've been moving through the processes of getting their mandate sorted out in the various other thresholds that they have to meet. I couldn't tell you exactly what the threshold is, but there's a number of criteria, and I think there's something like 55 or 56 iwi groups going through that process. But we've yet to see.
So up to 55 iwi groups could get this advance?
Well, they're generally eligible. The issue is that they will decide themselves whether they want to go into the process of getting themselves ready effectively for an early settlement payment. And even then, as they go through it, whether they actually want to buy the shares, because for some of them it wouldn't be suitable, for others they would want to. So we can't prejudge how many are going to do it. We would, on our reasonable expectations, it won't be a large amount of shares.
Won't that put them at an advantage to iwi that have settled though, who will have to stand in the market and maybe be scaled back? And you're saying that those who haven't settled might get, consideration from you.
Well, that just brings them all up to a level playing field, essentially, that the ones who haven't settled will have the same opportunity as those who have settled. That's how we see it.
When you say it's subject to market conditions, can you...
So they can choose to look at all of those issues. But there's nothing new with that situation already through this process. There are situations where iwi can buy properties and things in advance. It's not new.
But iwi will be able to get in at the book build level like an institutional investor.
Well, effectively that starting process, if they're an on-account settlement, if they haven't completed their settlement, but will otherwise indicate they want to buy.
So can Ngāi Tahu get in at the institutional?
They'll also be able to apply they've settled, but they'll be able to apply like anybody else, and like all of them, they'll all be subject to the government basically making those allocation decisions when it does so.
Yeah, but I mean, will they be treated as an institutional investor rather than as a retail investor?
Well, effectively, they're not retail per se, but the exact definition that you have on it. But essentially, again, the government makes those allocation decisions. We're not expecting those numbers to be large, but they may be of some interest to some iwi that haven't seen.
So looking at your definition here of a New Zealand bank account, it says you need a New Zealand address. Does that mean that New Zealand citizens living overseas, say in Australia, won't get the benefit of the non-scaled allocation and so on?
Well, New Zealanders living in Australia will have to be able to meet the requirements of the test. So they will have to be able to demonstrate citizenship or permanent residence, New Zealand bank account, New Zealand in their revenue number, and have a New Zealand address. Now, many people who are working in Australia or elsewhere will be able to meet those requirements because they will have a New Zealand address of which they use for their various correspondences in New Zealand.
You said it had been restricted. What's the change then that it was originally?
The change, well, it's restricted in the sense that you have to meet those 4 requirements. It's not just anybody who's in New Zealand can send an application.
But you said before that the requirements or the criteria for what constitutes a New Zealand investor had been restricted from what it had been originally.
Well, it's restricted in the sense that you have to provide these other pieces of information, just not a straight declaration that you are a New Zealander. So we are requiring the additional pieces of information.
So that the original criterion, was it just a declaration that you were a New Zealand citizen?
No, that's what we've had previously. The government, though, this is not a change from where we were earlier on. nominal piece. This is indicating, with respect to previous public floats, this is a tighter criteria.
Is
What
the
decides
gov-
how many Australians, how many shares are likely to go to Australian investors? And is that demand likely to, will that play a factor in how much the Kiwi investors will get scaled back?
Well, if I can just make one point to you, we are extremely limited in the amount of advice that we can offer you or comments that we can make because of securities legislation. You know, all we can tell you is we are going through a process now, which we formally kicked off tomorrow, where there's a pre-registration and where New Zealanders will be able to indicate their interest. Then past that retail piece, there will be an opportunity for institutions, both domestically and internationally, to consider their interest. When all of that is basically known, we'll go through a price setting process and an allocation process. But the government's intentions are crystal clear, and that is to put New Zealanders at the front of the queue to ensure that at least 85% of the companies are owned by New Zealanders, and that New Zealanders at every turn are favoured. So it's only New Zealand retail investors that get a loyalty bonus. It's only New Zealand investors, retail investors, that know they won't be scaled under $2,000. You know, there's a whole lot of things in there that are done to favour New Zealanders. That's very unusual. A normal stock offering doesn't work that way. So there are no games here, but we are pretty limited by what we can say, and then you're just going to have to let it run through its process. But one thing you can be sure of, this is a highly political process, and the government intends to make sure that it honours its political commitments.
When you say that it's subject to market conditions, I mean, can you expand on that a little bit? Are you talking about not going ahead as a crisis, or would you say that today's prevailing market conditions are certain?
Well, again, every issuer always goes into an IPO process with the capacity to pull the IPO if there's a particular reason to do so. And that can happen right up until the last moment. That's just completely stock standard process that sits around an IPO. So the government, again, as the issuer, if you like, of these shares, gives itself that capacity. Now, there are always catastrophic events that could occur, and we obviously, right up to the sort of final hour, could make the decision not to go ahead with the IPO. It's not our intention to do that, but that's just stock standard.
But today's market conditions are suitable.
Yes, if it was happening today, it would be going in.
Why is
Does that mean you have a
conducted-
reserve price in mind?
Sorry?
Does that mean you have a reserve price in mind?
Yes. Again, I can't offer you advice on whether we think we'll meet that reserve.
Why has Treasury commissioned a look at Kiwi Bank's capital needs?
Or, you know,
Well, the Kiwi Bank and post that Kiwi Bank have been doing a strategic review. There's been a number of different signs of that. One has been the look at the deed around postal delivery services. Part of that has been looking at the capital needs of both organisations, and they are pretty different sort of organisations. One of them's got postal business that's shrinking, and the other one's got a banking business that's been growing. So we've been putting quite a bit of effort with the board over the last 6 months to get to the bottom of what the real capital needs of Kiwi Bank might be. Given two things. One is quite a lot of change in the regulatory settings of the banks generally, because we would have to meet any regulatory requirements as set out by the Reserve Bank, and also what new capital it may or may not need for growth purposes, bearing in mind that it's reporting reasonably significant profits and hasn't been paying dividends, so it's already got a real source of capital.
So is there any consideration of Kiwi Bank as a potential candidate for a partial float
No,
this term or next term?
no,
Or
it
another term?
hasn't been considered.
The 5 to 7 billion that you talk about raising from us, shouldn't that have been revised down given Solid Energy's problems?
Look, we could go round in circles on 5 to 7 billion. An estimate was made early on in the process. It's been reasonably academic as to what would happen until we had clearance through the legal process. The program could go ahead. Now that we've got sign-off, now the program can start. We're within a matter of weeks of publishing a first valuation or price range for Mighty River. So there's not really much point of going back and trying to re-estimate the total when we're pretty close to at least getting an indication for one company of what its value might be, and then we can, extrapolate from that if we want to.
Its current value is 3.6 billion. Do you expect it to basically raise about 1.8 billion, or would you expect it to vary considerably from that?
Yeah, look, we don't want to prejudge that.
What's the budget for your marketing exercise?
This current campaign, which is across television, newspapers, the internet, is about $1 million, just over $1 million. And if the level of pre-registration is very, very strong, there is a possibility we could dial that back a bit, but the budget is about 1.1 million.
What's
How
your
much
expectations for how many people do you think might pre-register?
I think it would be quite unwise for us to speculate on that, but the reason why we are spending such a large amount of money is because we want that widespread New Zealand ownership, and it's important that ordinary New Zealanders understand exactly what they need to do in this whole process, and that's the reason why we've got pre-registration, promoting the fact that people can go on the website, the 0800 number, go elsewhere and look for information. If we are to have lots of New Zealanders do this, we have to make sure they're informed on how to do it.
Does it have the capacity to handle hundreds of thousands of people applying online or calling the number?
I've been assured by our advisors, and let me assure you, I've gone through this, that they're pretty confident that the website will be able to deal with a wide range of traffic. The service, I think, is being provided by the people who help the Queensland government with Queensland Rail, so they've got quite a lot of experience in how to deal with it.
What company is, what company is running that marketing campaign?
I haven't got the details on
What's the total cost of the IPO, including the advertising campaign?
Well, the total cost of the IPO, I think, as Bill would confirm, we've always indicated would be around 2% of the proceeds overall. This is across the whole program, and that's pretty standard. In fact, if anything, that's on the lower side of what others would have experienced.
What's the cost of this IPO, though, is the question. What's this, the figure being used is about 20 million so far, is that right?
Look, we've been reporting them quarterly, and that's, I think, all costs for the government and for the company. Look, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what the cost is. It's been a bit, because of the extended process, process has in some parts been more costly than was expected right at the start for this float. But if we don't have to go through the same process for the other floats, then the cost should be down a bit. But the costs incurred today are publicly available information.
How much would have the cost been added to because of the legal challenge that would have worked up that $24 million figure from December up quite significantly?
Oh, look, I'd have to go back and have a look, but by far the large costs are involved in the whole really meeting the legal requirements. So this isn't just a matter of paying people to sit around and have meetings. The Securities Act has a high level of requirements. They are strict. You've got to comply with the international requirements of other jurisdictions as well, and that is where that's where the bulk of the cost is incurred, simply meeting the legal requirements for an offer to the public.
Will you
The
suppose?
High Court and the Supreme Court case must have added costs on as well.
Yes, it would have added cost, but I wouldn't want to overstate it as a large extra.
Do you expect to announce in the budget what you'll spend this money on? Can you give us any more specificity what you will spend it on? And thirdly, can you rule out using some of it to recapitalise Kiwi?
I don't want to rule anything in or anything out, particularly at a relatively early stage of the budget process. But in the budget, we will be outlining further development of the Future Investment Fund, which we announced in the last budget. The proceeds of these sales will be used to meet the important capital needs the government faces, and they are generally around the rebuild of Christchurch and the upgrading of our schools and hospitals.
If New Zealand retail investors and maybe New Zealand institutions, for whatever reason, decide they don't like the look of this offer, and you can't get to 80 or 85%.
You're playing games. You're playing games.
I mean,
You're playing games.
Would you get Australians to top it up?
Okay, you're playing games. You're playing games because I can't answer the question because the Securities Act stops me doing that. We've made some crystal clear political commitments governments, I'd expect us to honour them. End of story.
Just on that though, Prime Minister, New Zealanders are at the front of the queue, aren't they? But there's a limit. They're being held back
Right.
with that $2,000 limit.
No, because that is the estimate that we've had is likely to be the amount that on average, the vast bulk of what you'd count to be a retail investor would apply for. But there are some extremely high net worth individuals in New Zealand who could apply for massive amounts if it was unlimited simply because they are deemed to be a retail investor.
Yeah, but there's a massive amount of mum and dad investors who might want to invest $3,000, $4,000, $5,000.
Well, you guys are arguing from different sides of the same argument. One of us is telling you that we might not make 85%, the other is telling us there's so much interest that we might not be able to fill it all. It's one or the other. All I'm telling you is wait and see 3 weeks and see how it goes. Judge us on what we do. But look, if there is widespread New Zealand ownership, that is the aim of what the government's doing. The government is doing everything it can to make it attractive to New Zealanders in terms of the information, accessibility of that information. They need to make their own financial decisions in terms of what they want to do. And then this will be a very public process, and New Zealanders will judge whether we've met our political promises that we campaigned on.
Is it possible that New Zealanders will miss out on some of the shares they want, while Australian financial institutions get some shares?
Look, I don't think we should speculate on that. That does depend on the outcome of demand and the whole process around here. As the Prime Minister said, we're quite restricted by what the Securities Act says in terms of speculating. But the main goal in all of this, the Prime Minister has been repeatedly clear with both of us on this, is we're after widespread New Zealand ownership between 85 and 90% at the end of today. And that's what we're working towards.
So does that mean that you actually want 10 to 15% of non-New Zealand ownership?
I don't think it means we want that. I think what we're saying is realistically, there's different categories within what you're talking about. So, there's a whole bunch of New Zealanders who at a retail level might go and buy $2,000 or want to buy $3,000 worth of shares. Then there's a set of New Zealand institutions. Then there's actually Australian institutions that manage money for New Zealanders. Now, I've absolutely no doubt there'll be other international institutions that will be interested. But the government has said repeatedly it intends to honour a process which favours New Zealanders, and the government decides the book build.
So could it be 100% New Zealand owned? Could you get a situation where the demand's so strong in New Zealand that you just go, yep, 100% New Zealand?
Well, it could be. That's always, again, technically possible, but I think that's not 100% likely either. I think there's something in between there. I think you just have to wait and see.
Is this going to put New Zealand back into the black by 2014, 2015?
Well, the main thing that will get us back into the black is continued control of our operational spend. That's the biggest influence. This will help, particularly in the longer term, as we try to get to our debt target, which is 20% of GDP by 2020. So government debt will peak at about 30% of GDP. We want to get it down to 20. So this will certainly help us in that respect. So it has some small fiscal positive effect, depending how you measure it. You're having an argument in the House about different ways of measuring it, show small pluses or minuses. But the biggest benefit from the point of view of the government's books is keeping the total amount of debt down and helping us get to our longer term debt target of 20% by 2020.
Are you still on track though to be back in the black 2014?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you give us an assurance that the advertising campaign is non-political, or do you think that's sort of impossible to make it non-political?
Us? No, look, it's gone through all the various checks that the Treasury would normally have to comply with respect to government advertising.
And what sort of advertising campaign will there be in Australia? Will there be one?
No, there won't be any
There's
regional.
not one in Australia.
Do you have any thoughts on how long the lock-up period in the loyalty plan needs to be effective? Or what are the
Look, the design of the loyalty scheme is something we'll turn our minds to in, of course, the next few weeks. We've got some ideas of what it might look like and how it might apply, but once we've gone through the pre-registration process, we'll be in a position to outline that. People will be absolutely aware of that before they go to the next stage, which is actually to actually firm up their interest in buying shares.
You said 3 years for that, you said 3 years when you announced, well, roughly about 3 years, is that still what
We said that's a possibility. Let's wait and see.
The timetable is about 2.5 months that you've outlined today. Would you have wanted longer, ideally?
Yeah, no, I think that's all right, yeah.
You don't think that doesn't carry any risks of things not being well enough prepared in terms of currency information that's going out?
No, I mean, I think, we've had obviously a chance to work on this. I mean, there's been a number of sort of semi-false starts to get to this point. So, no, I think we've been in a position to be able to do this. I'm confident we'll be able to execute the plan well.
On the review, on the review of macroprudential policy that the government's doing with the Reserve Bank, do you think lending growth and the sorts of loan-to-value ratios that are happening at the moment are high enough to justify limits on loan-to-value ratios for mortgages?
Well, Minister of Finance will answer that. I mean, from my perspective, all I'd say is that, look, it's a discussion document that the Reserve Bank Governor is going to issue. In the end, we can see the damage that financial instruments and excessive lending did to the housing market initially in the United States and ultimately their economy. And we have to ensure that we are careful in New Zealand. The integrity of the banks, the health of their capital base is critically important. And of course the Governor has at his disposal the ability to move interest rates up and down and a number of other tools. I think he's going through a process of talking to the banking sector and interested parties about whether there is the need to have either more tools or a better way of accessing those. Actually, I think that's what a prudent Reserve Bank Governor would do. He's engaging in debate and dialogue. Whether it will be successful or not, that's participants to talk about when they often put in their submissions.
Just on the Australian retail end of the share market, the listing in Australia, that will be available to retail investors there, obviously.
Yeah, well, obviously someone can theoretically buy a share there, but they could also on the New Zealand exchange if they want to. I mean, it's really a practical point. I mean, Air New Zealand, which is the poster child for a mixed ownership model, is listed on the Australian exchange.
Yeah, but someone in Australia could buy shares with no limit. Obviously, they won't face a limit over there, will they?
Yeah, but they don't go through the book-build IPO process. That's in the secondary market. It's true, but that's true of any shares. And again, as say Air New Zealand and Contact and plenty of other companies have been listed for a long period of time, and they've all gone flooding over to Australia.
Do you support calls for an inquiry after the death of the soldier in Afghanistan?
Look, I mean, again, I think you're well and truly aware, as others are, that there are significant suppression orders there. All I can say is I'm confident that the military has a robust process for dealing with gay and lesbian employees, that they have a clear code of conduct, and it's my expectations that they honour their both legal and legal requirements. There's nothing more I can say on that particular point.
And are you planning to look again at adventure tourism and whether the Deputy
So that's just another go, so appreciate it, catch plane. The answer to that is I don't have any details on what's taken place at Woodhull. I'm obviously concerned about the fact that New Zealand has lost his life. The whole issue of adventure tourism, the government takes very seriously. We've made some changes. We hope that they have covered any loopholes that we identified in the past. We've been reiterating to the sector our expectations around drug and alcohol policy. We've made it clear to them that if they can't work what is effectively currently a voluntary process of administering their drug and alcohol policies, then we'll take another further step. We're hosting an adventure tourism conference here in about 2 months' time, where I'll be opening that conference, and I have been publicly and privately making it clear to the sector that it's my expectation that every person that works in that industry and every company that operates there will adhere to the highest standards, because if they don't, in my view, it will damage the reputation of New Zealand. There's always some risk in these activities, but we can't have a situation where the weakest link works around